The Menzies Oration is an annual public address designed to stimulate robust and challenging discussion about issues of importance in the Northern Territory and nationally. Tonight, this will be a profound, I think, example of just that. Here at Menzies, we, through our work and through this type of discussion, do want to stimulate such critical analysis and debate. We are committed to doing research that delivers results. We place a very high priority on translating research into action, building capacity of communities and meaningfully improving people's lives. For over 35 years, we have worked hand in hand with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across Northern and Central Australia and with communities across this Asia-Pacific region. This evening, I'm delighted to invite Leanne Liddle, who will deliver the 2019 oration, Where is Justice? Leanne is an Aranda woman, born and raised in Alice Springs. She has degrees in environmental science, law and management, and is passionate about improving human rights and providing a voice for people who need to be heard. She has served in many senior roles in state, both Northern Territory, South Australia and internationally, for the United Nations, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and UNESCO. She is now the Director of the Aboriginal Justice Unit, where she has been working with her team to deliver the Northern Territory's first Aboriginal Justice Agreement, the draft of which is now available, or which is now publicly available. I was fortunate personally to be invited to participate in the reference committee for the agreement and saw firsthand Leanne's passionate commitment, dedication and capacity to develop an agreement which fundamentally aims to improve justice services so that Aboriginal people are treated fairly, respectfully and without discrimination. Her talk tonight will consider key changes in the justice system and identify challenges now facing us to achieve equity and justice for Aboriginal people. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome Leanne Liddle to present the 2019 Menzies Oration.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen and distinguished guests. Thanks for that, Alan. I'm honoured to have been asked to do this year's Menzies Oration. My first duty is to thank Aunty Billawara Lee for that warm welcome to country and acknowledge that I'm presenting on Aboriginal land. I'd also like to welcome the many Aboriginal people here in the audience. But tonight my presentation is titled, Where is the Justice? And to respond to that question, I need to talk about discrimination based on race, or to put it simply, racism, and its intersection with justice outcomes for Aboriginal Territorians. And I want to illustrate this with some of the testimonies and experiences of Aboriginal people, alongside the data and the statistics and research that we captured as part of the development of the draft Northern Territory's first Aboriginal Justice Agreement. Justice, according to the Collins English Dictionary, is defined as fairness. And within that definition, there's no doubt that it applies to all people, regardless of their colour, race, class, gender and status. And even the scales of justice that are so often used to represent the court system embody the principle that truth and fairness must be balanced in the delivery of justice. It's a symbol that's used in many Western presentations of modern law to represent the idea that the law must be applied fairly without such influences as bias, privilege or corruption. And sometimes the scales are held by the figurehead Lady Justice, who is portrayed often blindfolded, dressed in flowing robes, holding a sword along with her scale. That stands for the need to use force to back up moral imperatives when necessary. But despite the symbol and the principle that are upheld to define justice, The prism that we see through as Aboriginal people here in the Northern Territory in the delivery of justice is very different. Because justice requires more than just symbols and principles, as it needs to apply the principle of equity. And equity requires a recognition that treating people as if we were all the same can actually generate inequalities. And that's because equity is not about everyone getting the same share. Instead, equity is about doing things differently to accommodate the realities of what we're trying to remedy, with the acknowledgement that it needs to be fair. And the delivery of fairness means doing more for some than for others. Now, we weren't blinded nor were we strangers to this when we captured this for the content of the two documents, the agreement and the justice agreement. Two documents that bring together the background information and the consultation findings and the evidence that it's provided the rationale for the initiatives of the 23 proposed strategies. Currently, as a draft for further consultation, the agreement will be delivered in 2 stages over its 7-year proposed lifespan, and it's an agreement that has the following 3 aims. 1 is to reduce reoffending and offending rates, imprisonment rates of Aboriginal Territorians. 2 is to engage and support Aboriginal leadership. And 3 is to improve justice responses and services to Aboriginal Territorians. But before I outline the findings and the evidence, it's important to highlight some of the realities that we live with as Aboriginal people here in the Northern Territory. In the Northern Territory, Aboriginal people make up 30% of the total population. The median age of Aboriginal Territorians is 26 years, and 30% of the Aboriginal population is aged between 0 and 14 years. Almost 77% of Aboriginal people live in remote or very remote areas, and 60% of the Aboriginal population speak an Aboriginal language at home, where there is a proud and rich selection of 104 languages. In order to capture the breadth and depth of the diversity of views from Aboriginal people across the NT for the Justice Agreement, we had to make sure that we didn't just listen and hear the voices of those who spoke the loudest, or from the people who had the best grasp of English, or the people who were the most approachable, nor the people that were easiest to get to, who were so often conveniently sitting around a boardroom or members of peak represented bodies. No, we did a lot more. We listened and we heard from people who have spent their lives in the shadows, people who have been silenced, and people who had a poor grasp of English. And we listened and heard from those Aboriginal people who told us that they were very angry and upset with the continued levels of high disadvantage in their communities or towns, where they had talked to many people with all different titles, from different places, from different agencies for decades. And yet they felt powerless. And they felt that no one was listening and nothing had changed in their lives, their children's lives, or their grandchildren's lives. In fact, many people told us that their lives were now worse than ever. And it was at these consultations that we were told and we saw firsthand the normal practice where consultations or meetings with Aboriginal people involved an expectation or a requirement that Aboriginal people representing a community would bring to the table only a single view from all the Aboriginal people in that area, regardless of the diverse values and needs of that community, regardless of the level of expertise in that area, and regardless of the circumstances and impact of past policies and histories, and regardless of the subject matter. One commonplace form of racism in Australia is this tendency to dump all Aboriginal people into an undifferentiated category, quite unlike those non-Aboriginal people who pride themselves on their individuality. This refusal to acknowledge diversity is compounded by failures to follow good research practice, by not referring back draft findings and proposed recommendations to Aboriginal people in the communities involved in the consultations, let alone having a process that allowed further time for people to fully understand their obligations and commitments, or have further meetings to present the final findings. So with this awareness and equipped with the lived experiences and knowledge of generations of Aboriginal people who have not had access to the services they need, that has resulted in poor outcomes and the levels of disadvantage, we knew we had to design an extensive consultation process that could identify and capture both the issues and solutions developed in partnership with Aboriginal people, to identify the underlying causes and factors that have led to the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the justice system. And that's exactly what we did. Because the content for the Justice Agreement was designed and developed through an extensive process that was not just measured by the number of consultations or the kilometres that we travelled. Instead, we travelled across the entire Northern Territory in an unhurried manner, alongside interpreters and cultural brokers, to listen and hear from Aboriginal Territorians who live in both urban, regional, remote and very remote areas, where Aboriginal people had different relationships and experiences with many agencies and authorities, where we heard and listened to Aboriginal people who were victims, witnesses, offenders and professionals, where there were different views to fix different problems. From people who were deeply entrenched or frequent or casual users of government and non-government systems, and the many who had had no contact with the justice system at all. Where we heard that some communities had had up to times 83 agencies delivering services to their small community to no more than 2,000 Aboriginal residents, and yet the disadvantage existed and persisted. Now, some may say that this model, when this type of service delivery, is something that they would find challenging to deliver on, based on time, skill and cost. Some may say it's because we are experts, but what I say is this: it's a process that accommodates the realities of appropriate levels of service delivery to the 30% of the Northern Territory's population. It's a model that we should not be aiming for. Instead, it's a model and a process that Aboriginal people are entitled to. And this is just one of the many ways in which we should be delivering justice to Aboriginal Territorians on any process that affects directly, indirectly, formally or informally on any Aboriginal Territorian. Now, during the 2 years as we travelled across the NT and as we completed our consultations, we encountered many an expert. Experts not unlike this former senior public servant, who I'll call Mr. X, and I quote, "I have dedicated my entire life to work with Aboriginal people in Aboriginal affairs." Well, Mr. X, I've lived my entire life relying on your expertise and your dedication to change the levels of disadvantage for my family across the past 3 generations. And despite all your good intentions and academic talents and years of dedicated work, it hasn't made an ounce of difference to our lives. So I'll just add you to the long list of experts and well-intended people to be one of those many people who have failed us. Now, without doubt, there are many people who've earned respect for their research and policy work, particularly in the area of health. However, there remains disturbing disparities of power, wealth, status and capacity of these experts who stand outside of the turmoil and pain they describe that still persist. And the vast majority of these experts are not Aboriginal people. Consequently, the problematic nature of their position could be described as white privilege, a result of colonisation where white privilege in all its forms remains a fundamental oppression for Aboriginal Australians. And despite the increasing numbers of highly qualified Aboriginal researchers, public servants, policymakers and officials, and the ever-increasing number of Aboriginal parliamentarians, this does not guarantee a quick transformation of such problems, nor access to all the solutions to the present challenges facing Aboriginal people, especially because as many of these Aboriginal experts are trained and evaluated from the prevailing non-Aboriginal academic and governmental sectors. And that's because all those who wish to generate explanations, recommendations and strategies meant to fix Aboriginal issues typically forget or they fail to undertake one of the many essential components of critical analysis, and that is the requirement to ground truth any work undertaken through sustained, respectful and accountable relationships with those whose lives are being assessed and those whose lives will bear the brunt of resulting policies and programs. So tonight, as my focus is principally on the justice system, it requires that I tease out some of the facts and findings and realities that present themselves here in the Northern Territory. Sometimes these findings were consistent with available research and literature, and sometimes they were new or framed in new ways. And sometimes they were quite contrary to the accepted positions adopted by governments and the so-called experts. But the data and the statistics painted the same picture every time. In fact, they provided the factual evidence-based platform that highlights the unequal treatment and disparities between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people here in the Northern Territory. It'll be old news for many of you here in the audience tonight to hear that Aboriginal Territorians are overrepresented in the criminal justice system as both offenders and victims. This disparity pervades every point of contact in the justice system in the Northern Territory. In fact, since 2017, we have had the highest incarceration rate in the world for any Indigenous group. And addressing this disparity will require more than thinking that we as Aboriginal people just need to follow the rules and not break the law. It will require more than just additional money. Instead, it will require a total shift in power, attitude and culture. Because here in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal youth make up almost 100% of all the youth in our detention centres, no matter what the actual figure. And despite Aboriginal youth accounting for 45% of the NT's total population aged 10 to 17 years, our data identified in the Justice Agreement that as an Aboriginal youth, the offence that I'm likely to be charged with is unlawful entry with intent to break and enter. And I'll inevitably join up with the 80% of those unsentenced Aboriginal youth in detention. And if I'm granted bail, then I'll join the almost 92% of youth who are apprehended for breach of my bail conditions. Whereas an Aboriginal youth, I'm overrepresented in the criminal justice system to an even greater extent than my parents. And as an Aboriginal adult, the picture's not too dissimilar. Data shows that Aboriginal people are taken into police custody in 75% of proceedings compared to 57% for non-Aboriginal people. That results in an arrest and report rate 10 times that of a non-Aboriginal person. Again, I'm less likely to be granted bail, particularly due to my previous convictions and a lack of suitable housing, coupled with the fact that I will have significant difficulties maintaining a permanent residential address, let alone stable employment. And if I'm found guilty, I'm more likely to receive a term of imprisonment, with data showing that 60% of Aboriginal Territorians receive a term of imprisonment for their principal offence, compared to 34% for non-Aboriginal Territorians, who are more likely to receive a fully suspended sentence or a monetary order for exactly the same offence. And I'm then likely to join the 60% of Aboriginal Territorians who will return back to prison within 2 years of release. As an Aboriginal woman, I will be imprisoned at a rate at 14 times that of my non-Aboriginal counterpart. In fact, during the period 2008 to 2017, the rate of Aboriginal women in prison increased by 109%. And the picture is no better as an Aboriginal victim. In the NT, 9 out of 10 of all domestic and family violence-related assaults are Aboriginal. And in 2017, Aboriginal Territorians accounted for almost 70% of all victims of assaults in the Northern Territory. Have no doubt, the data, research and experiences of Aboriginal people demonstrate that Aboriginal people are dealt a different hand to that of non-Aboriginal people at every stage of the justice system, as articulated by former Chief Justice of Western Australia, Wayne Martin, in the following statement, where he said, "Aboriginal people are more likely to be questioned by police than non-Aboriginal people. And when questioned, they are more likely to be arrested rather than proceeded against by summons. If they are arrested, Aboriginal people are much more likely to be remanded in custody than given bail. Aboriginal people are more likely to plead guilty than to go to trial, and if they do go to trial, they're much more likely to be convicted. If Aboriginal people are convicted, they are much more likely to be imprisoned than non-Aboriginal people, and at the end of their term of imprisonment, they are much less likely to get parole than non-Aboriginal people. So at every step in the criminal justice process, Aboriginal people fare worse than non-Aboriginal people." It paints a grim picture alongside those grim statistics. But you can't have a discussion without justice and equality without the recognition of its links to its social determinants of health. Researcher Michael Marmont states that these measures clearly identify a link to justice outcomes that include a broad range of personal, social, economic and environmental factors that determine individual and population health. The social determinants of health include the following measures: social gradient, stress, early life experiences, social exclusion, including racism, unemployment and working conditions, social supports, addiction, food consumption, and transportation. Specifically, these social determinants are reflected in the Commonwealth's Closing the Gap targets, developed in 2008 to close the gap of the current levels of disadvantage experienced by Aboriginal Australians. The targets focus on similar factors as Marmont's, including life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy levels, early childhood education, school attendance, Year 12 attainment and employment, but none relate to discrimination based on race. And despite all the investment and effort that we've put into addressing our high levels of disadvantage, we've only managed to nationally progress, note, not close any gap, on 3 of the targets: child mortality, Year 12 attainment, and the enrolment of all 4-year-olds in early childhood education. And when reviewing efforts to close the gap in the Northern Territory, the data shows this: that for life expectancy, Aboriginal women live on average 12.8 years less, and men 11.5 years less than non-Aboriginal men and women. For education, 14.2% of Aboriginal Territorians have completed Year 12 compared to 58.7% of non-Aboriginal Territorians, a difference of nearly 45%. And we have lower school attendance rates at 62% compared to our non-Aboriginal students at 88%. Our unemployment rate stands at 25% compared to 2.3% for non-Aboriginal people. That's 6 times the unemployment rate, no matter what my age. My average weekly income as an Aboriginal person will be $430 per week, compared to the $1,247 of a non-Aboriginal Territorian, where Aboriginal people make up 80% of the homeless population, compared to 9% of non-Aboriginal Territorians. All of these disparities not only contribute to gross inequalities in health and well-being, but also to the huge overrepresentation within the criminal justice system that I detailed earlier. Realities that may be hard for you to accept, but they're even harder to live with. Now, I want you to remember that all this has happened with a historically recent level of investment of money and resources that's not been provided to any other racial group in Australia. And all this has happened on Aboriginal land in a territory where most of it has been returned back to the custody or control of Aboriginal people under legislation that's aimed at improving our lives. And all this has happened in the so-called lucky country. And yet it's the country where we as Aboriginal people are over-policed, over-regulated, and over-represented in the criminal justice system more so than any other race of people in Australia. This stasis is all wrapped up in policies and practices that have been established and delivered with the intention and expectation that would improve our lives and equalise the imbalance and reduce our levels of disadvantage as Aboriginal people. But on all levels, these approaches continue to fail us. So one of the many questions that needs to be asked and answered next is, how has this all happened? Well, here's one answer: the existence of discrimination based on race. And whilst we've concentrated on so many other factors, I call them symptoms of the problem. We must face the reality that racism is a key factor that impacts on us ever being able to achieve any progress towards achieving any gains. Now, I recognise that racism is an uncomfortable topic for many of you to hear and listen to me as I talk about it tonight, but I make no apologies nor concessions for that. Because we as Aboriginal people live with the consequences if we continue to fail to acknowledge that racism is a fundamental factor that influences and contributes to our lived life experiences of disadvantage. And we heard that desperation in the voices, and we saw the sadness in people's eyes when we asked people on the consultations, how should we address the disparity and high levels of disadvantage for you in your community? And it's probably best reflected in this most sad and depressing comment. The only way to overcome the disadvantage and to break free is to basically forget that you're Aboriginal. But you can never forget that you're Aboriginal. Yet racism and its link to the current outcomes that we're dealing with was raised at every single consultation that we attended, regardless of its location or the content. But what is racism? Well, racism is broadly defined as avoidable and unfair actions that further disadvantage the disadvantaged or further advantage the advantaged. And racism is a result of a complex interplay of individual beliefs, shared values and ideologies, and institutional practices, where racist beliefs are often reinforced by widely held social attitudes and vice versa. It can be expressed through stereotypes, prejudice, or discrimination, and it has many forms that interact and mutually reinforce each other. And one form of racism that I want to highlight tonight is systemic or institutionalised racism. And that's racism that's embedded in social, political, and economic structures and processes. And the spotlight of racism as a cause and not a symptom of Aboriginal people's overrepresentation in the justice system is nothing new. Some 28 years ago, in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the commissioners acknowledged that it was a subject that tended not to be talked about very openly, and its existence is often vigorously denied by those who are the most obvious practitioners. And despite their recommendations to address it, it remains unaddressed. Instead, we've focused on the symptoms of racism as a principal cause of the disadvantage and continuations of the disparities. Many people told us that they'd experienced racism every day, and we were told that racism was accepted, with some people describing it as a normal part of life for Aboriginal Territorians. But what needs to be understood when we were told this, we knew, and then what you should know, is that we weren't talking about the daily experience where Aboriginal people were called racist names or when they were refused service at a shop. No, instead what it meant was that in every part of their lives, from access to employment, accessing a computer, buying goods from the local store, navigating or accessing government and non-government programs, or having a health issue seen by the clinic, racism was present. And it was embedded in informal or formal policies in all its forms. I want to provide you with some of the testimonies that we heard up on the screen. Aboriginal people told us that when they rang 000 for an emergency response from police, ambulance or fire, that there was no interpreter available. And very few emergency call takers could even say their community's name, let alone say their name. So in frustration, the caller hung up, and now many people told us that they don't even bother calling the police to report crime anymore, whether that be as a victim or an offender or a witness. But here's another fact you should know. If you spoke any of the 54 other international languages, say Spanish or German or Mandarin, there's a policy for that, and you'd be linked with an appropriate interpreter. Now, this matter was recently reported in the local paper, and here's one of the many comments from readers. Why are people that are living in Australia and supposedly attending school unable to speak and have a basic understanding of English? This is, after all, an English-speaking country. We were also told that in one community that houses a permanent police presence with several full-time police officers, that services a 99% Aboriginal client base, that the police station is not even open for 1 day a week for people to register their car or firearm or check if they're required to go to court, let alone build any type of relationship with the local police. And even then, we were told a police response can take up to 12 hours. We were told that people don't have the means to attend court at a cost of $600 each way, and with limited access to post, mail or internet services, most people aren't even aware when they've received a summons to attend court. We were told that the only public phone where there is no mobile service in this community is on the oval, in full view of the community, with lights. So if people call the police at night, everyone knows who's called, and it takes hours for the police to come out. And often once they arrive, the trouble has finished, and sometimes they even arrive the very next day. Or when a family member committed suicide, the mother was told to ring a 1300 number, which connected her to a person in Sydney who had no idea where her community was, and they couldn't even offer her counselling services. But what they did offer was a $150 Coles voucher to support the influx of visitors that were going to attend for the funeral. That was very helpful, yes, but not when the nearest Coles is an 8 hours drive away on a dirt road. Or what about the current hospital policy that says, should I leave my hospital bed unannounced, and if I'm absent from my hospital bed for more than 4 hours, I'm deemed to have self-discharged against medical advice? Forget the fact that it's a little bit hard when I tried to explain to you why I was doing that, because you didn't understand my broken English mixed with Walpuri, because I then felt so embarrassed, even though I knew that I was still sick and that the hospital was the best place for me. So answer me this question. Why would you leave a hospital that's trying to make you better, that you say is welcoming and culturally competent, when Aboriginal people's discharge rate against medical advice is 9 times higher than non-Aboriginal Territorians? Well, the simple answer is that you wouldn't. And we heard many stories like this, and it didn't matter if it was written in formal or informal policies, where we were told that the local health clinic had refused entry to subsequent medical treatment to people with children unless the kids were wearing underwear or a nappy as they walked through those clinic doors. A box of nappies in that community costs $80 from the local store. Where the policy of an NGO funded by government doesn't let the Women's Safe House take a mum if she's had 1 drop of alcohol. So you tell me, where does that mum go with her kids if the safe house won't take her? She goes back to where it's unsafe for everyone. Discrimination based on race can also exist in a more insidious form, where non-Aboriginal Australians portray Aboriginal people in a deficit discourse that pathologises Aboriginal culture and communities while denying the intergenerational trauma of past policies. And a prime example of that is Bill Luke's cartoon, which has been defended in many arenas as just being in good humour. But here's what I do know. All these stories and many more that we were told fit neatly into the definition of racism. That is, they produce avoidable unfair actions that cause us disadvantage. And racism in all its forms is a fundamental social determinant of overrepresentation in the justice system, just as much as it is a core social determinant of poor Aboriginal health. But the links between racism, disadvantage and health outcomes continue to be ignored in much health research, where it should become an essential component in health in research design, analysis and implementation, where the key issues of community control, knowledge transfer remains to be addressed, where unequal access to resources because of race can also result in poor health and well-being. The same very resources required for good physical, mental health and well-being. The very resources that can assist me to avoid negative contact with the justice system. The impact of racism can also induce negative responses amongst Aboriginal people, such as an increase in the uptake of smoking, alcohol and drug use, aggressive behaviours, suicidal thoughts and psychological distress. Behaviours that are all relevant and linked to Aboriginal people's contact with the justice system. Researchers have also found that in Australia, Aboriginal patients with the same need as non-Aboriginal patients are about 1/3 less likely to receive appropriate medical care across all conditions, in particular for diseases such as lung cancer and coronary procedures. Aboriginal Australians are 3 times less likely to receive kidney transplants than non-Aboriginal Australians, despite having the same level of need. Aboriginal women are also less likely than non-Aboriginal women to receive cervical and breast cancer diagnosis, screening and treatment, or be turned away from health services not to be believed about illnesses and to receive culturally unsafe care. Many laws, regulations, requirements and decisions have impacted more heavily on Aboriginal families than other Territorians over several generations, even when it wasn't their deliberate intention. And the NT's had its fair share of these. Examples outside the justice system include the NT intervention and the introduction of income management with the Basics card, changes to welfare employment program and the transfer of assets to local shires and more. And fundamental to these violations of Aboriginal Territorian civil and political rights is that deficit discourse and its underlying racism that I've just outlined. An example of this was the quarantining of payments for non-school attendance, where researchers have found no evidence that income management increases school attendance. Rather, it had the effect of reducing school attendance by 4% on average in the first 4-5 months, after which attendance eventually returned back to its initial level. Another was the impact of income management that was first introduced as a result of the intervention and still remains today. And findings suggest that income management does not improve one measure of child health outcomes, and by extension, income management does not appear to have produced the desired change in household consumption patterns, especially for pregnant women. Instead, it may even have a negative impact on newborn health, with lower than average birth weights and a higher probability of low birth weights resulting in a premature birth. What these findings and others highlight is that we must err on the side of caution when decisions and widespread sweeping policies are introduced that have the potential to impact on an already known vulnerable and disadvantaged group of people. Particularly so when these policies may result in unintended consequences that further entrench our disadvantage. Now, one could argue that freedom from racism and racial discrimination is well secured and captured within a number of international instruments and territory and Commonwealth laws that secures a person's ability to complain in our attempts to eradicate racism. But what we know is that the experience of racism by Aboriginal Territorians, they're not matched with the levels of reporting to complaint processes. Perhaps because this requires a phone and a computer, a confidential space, maybe an interpreter and a cultural broker, combined with high levels of personal resilience, strong mental health and confidence, and maybe money to get to town to make or follow up on that complaint, let alone a knowledge of how to navigate through that system. Perhaps it is, as we were told, that it's just too hard to make it an issue when you're dealing with all the disarray, grief and trauma in our lives. And then to add that to our list just becomes another fight that I just don't want to have. Perhaps that's why here in the Northern Territory over a 5-year period, the Anti-Discrimination Commission dealt with on average just over 42 complaints each year based on race from Aboriginal people. I've heard it said, perhaps just fixing the problem is a matter of changing policies to make the system more inclusive and accessible for Aboriginal people. Yes, changes to policies would assist, but they're not the only solution to such an entrenched problem. Combating racism requires personal qualities of courage, persistence, determination and strong leadership. It requires that we refuse to stand by and ignore or tolerate attitudes, behaviours, agency cultures and processes that allow racist outcomes to flourish. It requires we enact legislation, policies, regulations and governance complaint structures that strengthen and meet the needs of Aboriginal people, that enable Aboriginal leadership and self-determination to thrive, while dismantling systemic and institutionalised racism. We're transforming the routine and frequent experiences of marginalisation and racism for Aboriginal Territorians requires more than just vision statements espousing equitable treatment and access to short cultural awareness programs that typically ignore the diversity and intersectionality within the NT Aboriginal population. Because tackling racism requires not only a whole of government, but a whole of territory approach that's sustained and coordinated with its lens focused clearly on human rights and justice issues. It requires an abandonment of silo thinking and the disorganised, even contradictory interventions that reassure those in power who fail to engage, to learn from those impacted and disadvantaged by such assumptions and unconscious bias. It demands all of us, but especially governments, to embark on genuine power sharing and strengthening the capacity in all Aboriginal communities to unlock the current paralysis within the systems. Now, the current policy of local decision making is a step in the right direction. And perhaps that's why there was overwhelming support from Aboriginal people when we asked what was needed as part of the consultations for the Justice Agreement, when they told us that they wanted community courts and they wanted law and justice groups and they wanted the establishment of alternatives to custody. Perhaps that's why people have asked for parenting and respectful relationships programs that are fit for purpose and relevant to their individual communities, with these programs needed to be delivered with the assistance of interpreters, mentors, and strong role models. Where law and justice groups and community courts allow Aboriginal people the opportunity to assert leadership, to empower Aboriginal people to take on personal responsibility for offending behaviours. Where any thoughts of implementing short-term reactive and expensive responses like curfews will only create little meaningful change, because it's these sorts of platitudes that we cannot continue to maintain or support, as these types of responses reinforce ill-informed rhetoric that fail to address the underlying causes of crime. Now, as I've completed this journey with my 30 years' experience in the justice system, I've recognised some undeniable facts. That eliminating racism is not something that we as Aboriginal people can achieve alone. And that's because it's owned by others. And those others are those that cause the pain and benefit from their unacknowledged privileges. And it's those who need to take the lead, to do most of the heavy lifting and to realise that combating racism benefits everyone. And whilst Aboriginal people are denied access to the full range of services that other Territorians take for granted, the delivery of justice will continue to be reflected in the disproportionately high rates of imprisonment, homelessness, hospital admissions, substance misuse, and high suicide rates. And the failure to acknowledge this will continue to impact on all areas of life for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Territorians by costing taxpayers more money to build bigger prisons, recruit more police, further clog up the courts, and even the placement of more children into care. So to conclude, the reality is that Aboriginal people have endured decades of disadvantage, poverty and ill health, all related to discrimination on the basis of race, much of it systemic and institutionalised. And the impact's been destructive and extensive, and its impact has not been isolated just to the justice system. It has corrosive and ongoing impacts across families, generations, and the wider community. And yet we all want the same outcome: a society where people can thrive, where we're treated fairly, free from racism. And it shouldn't be that hard to get there. But the moral imperatives and the recognition that we must do something now to fix it needs to happen. And I wonder if we're mature enough to see beyond the black and white issues that are framed in a particular way in the media and distorted today in Australia by the various forms of racism and political handballing. I wonder if the scales of justice will actually deliver on what they are meant to symbolise. A system that's colourblind and one that fundamentally challenges racism. And I wonder if one day I'll see the beauty that I've seen in the Sea of Change and Desert paintings that are on the front covers of the Aboriginal Justice Agreement and the Pathways documents, where the children who painted those artworks describe how we can work as a team with respect for one another, where, like in the desert painting, nature comes together after rain, where our future looks bright and beautiful. Where the colour blue in the Sea of Change painting is described as a metaphor for an undercurrent of change, led by our young people to give them a better chance of going to university rather than going to prison. Where we acknowledge and we accept that the scales of justice will need to be unbalanced for some time in favour of Aboriginal people to achieve the outcomes so desperately needed for Aboriginal people to achieve parity, whether that be in the health space, the justice space, or elsewhere. And where the heavy lifting that's needed to be done is done mostly by non-Aboriginal people. Where the change that needs to happen is not confined just to the water cooler or at the barbecue or at the local footy game, or for the solutions just to be owned by the experts. Instead, it requires a recognition that you need to ask yourself difficult questions to find the right answers. And the answers to those questions are held by those most affected. And now is the time that we need to accept and acknowledge that no matter how good a policy, no matter how good the legislation, and no matter how much money is directed at the issue, and no matter how well intended we are, if you've got a system that is built on foundations that support any form of racism, and if it remains unaddressed, we will never be able to close any gap. And we will never be able to address the disparity and disadvantage that exists for Aboriginal people on any level. And the injustices will remain. And we will continue to ask ourselves that same question: how did this happen? So thank you.
Leanne, thank you for that profound presentation. You certainly ask us the difficult questions and challenge us to work together to combat racism and those critical underlying factors that you have so clearly enunciated. I've spoken with Leanne and we wanted to depart a little from the normal, and she is happy to answer some questions. We thought that was appropriate, particularly in terms of the issues that have been discussed this evening. People should know, as is clear, this is Aboriginal Television Channel 4. We're filming the event.
I really appreciate what you've delivered to us. And sorry, Paul Tolliday is my name. And yeah, I guess it's always overwhelming to be confronted by the issues, do you also come with hope and see the change and the motivation from government and from all the inquiries that you did do as to whether that you see people maybe with some more direction looking to combat these things one at a time or systemically or something?
Since we've done our research and we've had and met with some of the agencies, we've been invited to go to those agencies and assist them to look at some of the issues that may exist in the policies and procedures that they may not have been aware of was impacting on Aboriginal people the way that it was. The other good news is that we're working on a pilot program with the Northern Territory Police where we have 2 interpreters probably in about 2 weeks' time going into the 000 call centre, both Northern and Southern language speaking interpreters, and they will be operating there for a 10-week period so we can identify some of the efficiencies and effectiveness in that process. The other issue that we've worked with the NT Police is the after-hours messaging, and I think that's rolled out to 54 police stations where people can now leave a message in language and understand that the police station's unattended, and if it's a non-urgent matter, they can call back at a later time, but if it's urgent to continue ringing, to hang up and to ring 000. We've seen a huge reduction in numbers from over 3,000 calls a month down to 700 and less, where people are now able to navigate a system because we put in place that small change.
Leanne, hi. I'm Sujay from the Anti-Discrimination Commission. Thank you so much for what you shared with us today. And as a person who benefits from white privilege every day of my life, I feel like I need to acknowledge that to you and to all Indigenous people and hope to be an ally. What I'd like to ask you about is, I've often thought our complaints model requires a degree of social capital that even non-Indigenous people often lack. And I encounter this in training all the time about why people don't complain. And I'm wondering, is it fundamentally incompatible within Indigenous culture? Is there a better model, a better way that maybe involves storytelling or circle work? Is there a different and more appropriate way to address that?
So as we travel through the Territory, people that have used the Anti-Discrimination Commission have said that their service delivery from your agency has been first class. So you should be very proud of that. And the information that they have received, they've told us that that has been empowered them. The decision is more difficult to make, I think, on people actually acknowledging when it is racism and discrimination and knowing where to go to and are they able to make that complaint and what happens next. Most of the times we found that the complaints were being made through third parties, so through NARJA, so people would relay a story to the lawyer or to another agency, a child care agency or child protection space, and then that person would advise them and say, we need actually you to go to the anti-discrimination if you want to take it further. So I think there's a lot of information sharing that needs to happen on our side of the fence for people to understand that these checks and balances and these complaints are actually going to benefit the system to make people aware of what needs to be fixed and not see it as a challenge or an attack on people's agencies or the way they deliver their service, that it actually will assist them to actually accommodate for the 30% Aboriginal population, which is not what is happening at the moment.
Hey Leanne, Gabby Hill, CDU law student. My question is, you know that I've been in the industry a long time and you know my values and what I stand for. How do we sell this to the public? We know it's needed. We know it's very much needed across all quarters and across all sectors, and acknowledging Miss Sally Sievers in front of me here as well. how do we sell this to the public who quite often say, oh, they're Aboriginal people, they get everything. All this money's always been spent on them and it never works, nothing goes anywhere. We've seen in the work that I do, as you know, the vigilante, especially working with the YMCA, the vigilante groups that come out and want to kneecap kids and all sorts of stuff. How do we sell this to people that think it's just another bit of wasted money thrown on people that really don't matter?
So that's where we want people to come to the table and tell us as part of the agreement what are the best measures and provide us with that feedback. We want to hear from people what's worked and what hasn't worked, and we want to know what would work here in the Territory now that people are a little bit more informed about the actual profile of the Territory. I'd like to see, personally, media campaigns which empower Aboriginal people and don't place us in the deficit position all the time. People told us stories of how when their community has signs out the front, the nice blue, signs, do not bring in alcohol, do not bring in pornography and do not do more, but not often are they displaying the good values, and we don't often celebrate a lot of the functioning communities that we did see when we went on our visits and how they were strengthened and what elements they had that other communities didn't, and put those communities front and centre to show this is what happens when you work well with Aboriginal people and these are the outcomes that can happen. I mean, some of those communities they had no social issues, no very low criminal activity, and yet they had no police station or police officer in sight. And we knew straight away when we went in those communities, if there are Aboriginal people in those stores at the checkout, and if there was Aboriginal people driving the cars, and if there were no kids around because they were all in school, we knew that something was going well in that community. And we got that information from people. And we need to sell those stories because we know when we get it right, we know what can happen.
Lenore Dembski, local person. And I really love the way you explain it all in really plain English, all the stuff. But my question is, when I was President Legal Aid from 88 to 94, people just went to prison. There wasn't any other alternatives, and even with the home detention and all that. So you did mention alternative programs. Can you just explain a bit more of that? Thanks.
So as we've gone through this journey, we haven't waited till we finish a document before we get any funding and start to deliver some of these outcomes that Aboriginal people said was needed. So we managed to secure from government money to fund 2 alternatives to custody. One in Alice Springs that deals with Aboriginal women, where people can get saturated and tailored and targeted rehabilitation to address their criminogenic risk factors that are impacting on their offending and reoffending. That in itself is the model that people said that they wanted and needed. The other model is, it's still in its infancy, will be delivered in Groote Island for Aboriginal men. These are community-controlled organisations, but people have said, this is what's missing. If you can bring to me and we can work together as a family unit and understand what my pressure points are, and we can deal with my medical issues, we can deal with the children who have been witnessing this behaviour as a family unit in a residential setting. That's really important for us to understand how we can stop our offending.
Can I just say thank you again? There will be more opportunity to talk with Leanne and for us all to discuss in the foyer after the end of tonight's proceedings. And can we just, as a small token of appreciation, present you with some flowers? That last slide that was up as well, I think, important that please do, I'm sure Leanne wants, that's why the slide's here, for people to access those sites and look at the agreement and the documents. Such a profound approach to engagement, looking at the evidence, and incredible amount of work led by Leanne and the team to develop the agreement and the pathways to the agreement documents and approaches. So please look at that, engage and participate, as Leanne was calling in this important work. Tonight also gives us the opportunity to present the Menzies Medallion, which is the highest award offered by the board of Menzies School of Health Research and recognises people who've made a very significant contribution to health in the Northern Territory. And this year it is my privilege and absolute pleasure to present the medallion to Professor Peter Dabbs for his contribution over so many years to research into substance misuse and work relating to alcohol and other drug policy matters. Peter's been an incredibly strong advocate for evidence-based policy and indeed for generating a lot of the evidence to inform that policy. Some of his important work has been around evaluation of alcohol management plans, a range of initiatives to address alcohol-related problems, and national evaluation of the rollout of low aromatic fuel in communities affected by petrol sniffing. And I'd like to invite Peter up here to accept the medallion.
Thank you. I will just say a few words. It has always, to me, felt like a privilege to be part of Menzies, and it still does. I was reflecting a little bit after Leanne's talk that this word privilege, of course, carries a lot of connotations. Those of us who work at Menzies are privileged, partly working at such a good place, but also because the fact that we come here as educated people, many of us from the dominant society, carries all sorts of responsibilities and connotations. So I hope I'm not in any way, I certainly don't want to sound for some sort of self-congratulatory or even sort of Menzies congratulatory tone when I say that I do think Menzies is an exceptional place. I think we should, while acknowledging the profound points that Leanne, that you've made, but I think we should also honour the kind of commitment that many people, my colleagues, past and present here, have brought, but to acknowledge not just to individual research projects, but to the broader sort of challenges that we are facing and that we are addressing. And to recognise, however, that we have to go on trying to do a lot better. And I think that your address tonight helps us to focus yet again on the very big challenges that lie ahead. So thank you.
Last year, the Menzies board created a new award, the Companion of Menzies, which has been established to recognise people who make exceptional contributions and support to the development of Menzies over Menzies School of Health Research. And this year the recipients are Pat Anderson, AO, and Tony Barnes. Pat's contributed to so many things, but she has contributed incredibly significantly to Menzies over a long period. Her outstanding leadership over so many years in the establishment, growth and sustainabilities of the CRCs for Aboriginal and Tropical Health, Aboriginal Health and the Lowitja Institute. She's played such an important role in helping to develop a cohort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research, and a new approach to community-driven approaches to research. She's, of course, known internationally as a powerful social justice advocate who works tirelessly to improve issues around health, education, development, and of such fundamental areas across a whole array of issues that impact upon Australia's First Peoples and are of such importance for the whole nation. So it's wonderful to be able to present this award to Pat.
I was very touched, I have to say, and I am very touched, because this relationship with Menzies and myself and sort of a group of us it's 25 years old, if not a little bit more. I remember you all when you all came here as young doctors. There's a few of you in the room. David, he came fresh to Danladilba just as we got started. He was our first sort of doctor, and he never went home. He's still here, and now he's a dad with 2 children. We've got many doctors like that. And Peter and Justine are here somewhere. Justine's been, oh there, Justine. Justine's been at Danladilba like forever. And she married Peter as well. And now they have grown-up sons. So, you know, it's a really long association. It's not always been, it's been pretty bumpy. We've had lots of fights over the years, and we've been all part of that. And when we started, you know, the first CRC, it was not our idea at all. It was Professor John Matthews from Menzies, and we fought, well, I in particular, fought with John for 4 years before we even got it up, because he kept putting in applications without using all our names and not asking us. So we've been through all of those kinds of situations as well. But now we do have, that was always our vision, to have the Lower Chair Institute. We're nothing but resilient. It's only taken us 25 years to get there. So it's been a real privilege and an honour, and I'm so happy that all you came as young doctors are still here and working in the Northern Territory and doing the things that Peter has spoken about. So it's one of the, and it's so nice to be home, to get this from home. So I'm going to shut up now.
Tony Barnes also is receiving this award. He's made very strong contributions to Menzies over the same period and provided leadership through his role as Director of the CRC for Aboriginal and Tropical Health, and has maintained incredibly important collaborations with Menzies throughout that entire period as well, you know, through to most recently his role as a statistician and, you know, a really critical explorer of a whole array of demographic issues in the Northern Territory through Charles Darwin University. But like Pat, I think these people who've played such a critical role with Menzies over such a long period, it's wonderful to be able to present this award also to Tony. Thank you.
Like Pat, very humbled as well. My thought was, why me? Because I've never ever really done anything in the area of research that hasn't been collaborative, and there's always been a whole range of other people at the other end of any work that I've done in this area. So my thought was, well, everybody should be getting one of these, or this is not just for me, it's everybody who's I've ever been associated with through Menzies. So thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this year's Menzies Oration. You can visit our website and find out more about Menzies, although many of you know about it. It tells you about our work and the staff who work here and opportunities to collaborate together. Thank you, good evening, and continue the discussion together.